In fact, we want to start again after this powerful witnesses from 4 different parts of the world. We now try to categorize and to bring a little bit, let's say, an analytical dimension into this conversation about how democracies can become more resilient in different threatened environments, and how we can counter these threats against democracy. So we want to do that with 3 very renowned academic specialists in this field. We have from Zurich University, Simona Grano, here in the middle. And we have from Fribourg University, Magdalena Maria Solska, on my left. And we have from the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, Clara. Welcome very much to this panel.
Thank you.
The idea is now that we initially let all these 3 academics give their views on these issues in a more initial statement or sharing with different focal points, because all of you have a little bit different perspectives and work fields on this. This will be about half an hour. Then we have some questions to each another here on the panel, which may occur before we then have a conversation with all of you. And at 12:30, there will be lunch served downstairs. So let's go. And I would like to invite first Simona. She has a few slides with her to give her inputs.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Thank you, all of you, for being here. I hear a super echo, but if it's not bothering you, that's okay. Then it's just bothering me. So Andrea actually has already touched upon a lot of points, so I will try to be brief. But basically what I would like to do in the presentation today is address a little bit of the challenges that are internal to Taiwan. As you know, Taiwan is, in a certain way, we can say by now, a very well-established democracy, but still relatively young. And there are some vestiges from the authoritarian era that are still present, and I would like to briefly touch upon them and then touch upon the of course, kind of threat that comes from the outside, from China, but we have already heard a little bit about that. So you know that Taiwan is, well, very peculiar in a way, because it's one of the few countries that actually did not just manage. We know about the 3rd wave of democratization in that phase by Huntington in the 90s and 80s. Many countries actually became democratic, but some of them sadly then underwent periods of backsliding, authoritarian backsliding. And Taiwan is still a very much vibrant democracy. It has had, of course, several party turnovers of power between DPP and Kuomintang. And as we heard, it now stands before the elections, right? So Taiwan actually today, we heard already, ranks very high, especially in East Asia, but not only. I will show you some statistics later. But what is important is some background information. We don't have to go into that a lot, but I highlighted in yellow these 2 dates because to this day, these are dates that are quite important because they represent when Taiwan first held actually its legislative elections for the Legislative Yuan, the parliament, in '92. The seats were frozen before that since the Kuomintang came over between 45 and 49. And then, of course, the first democratic presidential elections in which the Kuomintang back then with a Taiwanese candidate, Li Denghui, was elected again. Right. I think I don't have to go into the bottom parts, but I think it is important. You said it already. There are a variety of institutions, indexes that actually try to look for democratic countries. And Taiwan, as you can see here, was actually named in 2022 the 10th most democratic country in the world. And of course, in Asia, this is also important. It ranks higher than previous democracies like Japan, for example. Right. So I told you before that I would, before going into the threat by China, also address briefly what are the threats that scholars, when they look at post-authoritarianism in Taiwan, detect. And I have 3 possible examples that have been taking place in the past 20 years in Taiwan. First of all, rise of nostalgia for authoritarianism. There are some recent political figures that have campaigned on platforms that either harken back to a more authoritarian era of Taiwan or even on family legacies, right? I'm talking about, of course, the Jiang Jingguo family, the Chiang Kai-shek and Jiang Jingguo, his son, and their offsprings. The second point is marginalization of some groups under this democratic transition in a fully democratized country, but of course, even though democracies, as we know, do represent liberal values and, of course, transparency, justice, you still have many groups in Taiwan that to this day continue to experience marginalization. And I think interesting, I don't know if you heard about that, but for me a very interesting phenomenon was, of course, the Me Too movement in Taiwan that mostly attacked the DPP party and party elders, or mostly men, of course. And it came, as far as I know, you will correct me if I'm wrong, but it came to prominence actually in 2023, also thanks to the help of a Netflix series, Wave Makers, which talks about it, of course, in an indirect way. I'm saying this because the Me Too movement in the world was actually precedent to this in 2017, right? And the third point, authoritarian institutions and norms in post-authoritarian society, so things that are legacies of an authoritarian era but still persist today. For example, the fact that many aspects of Taiwanese politics are still structured according to its authoritarian past. You still have, for example, some rules that date back to that era that are very difficult to cancel or to break down. It's military, the rigid hierarchy of it, especially now coming under the loop because of the tense situation with China, and so on and so forth. Right, but of course, Taiwanese democracy I should not also just not only give you the negative points, but also the very positive point, and to that, of course, the DPP has really contributed a lot, especially under the presidency of Tsai Ing-wen. It has made enormous strides toward advancement of human rights and, of course, democracy. It has created, of course, commissions to address the authoritarian past, but also not just to address it, but also to redress the victims, to offer compensation. It has tried to offer more of a standing to still marginalized indigenous groups, and so on and so forth. And we heard before, Taiwan is also an example of the only actually East Asian countries that has legally codified a law for gay people to get married. And that was, of course, very much prominent when it happened 2 or 3 years ago. Right, and then of course it also, since we're talking about democracy, there's also a lot of talk about Taiwan experimenting with direct democratic procedures, such as, for example, simplified referenda proceedings that have been implemented in Taiwan. Right, so you probably might have seen this. A couple of weeks ago, there was an interview on the NZZ, which is one of the main daily newspaper in Switzerland, with Joseph Wu, the foreign minister of Taiwan, that talked about the threat of autocratic regimes. And of course, as very often is the case, he tried to make the case, and I agree with him, that this is not just a problem for Taiwan, but if we let this happen to any country, one day this will concern us. And of course, he also mentioned that China will not stop at Taiwan. China has, of course, its expansionistic mire also set on other places in East Asia, like the Senkaku Islands, and this, of course, concerns Japan, a border with India clashes, and so on and so forth. It was quite an interesting interview, which I would recommend for you to read. I'm not going to go into this in detail. I think I still have like 4 minutes. But I just want to mention to you 3 or 4 ways in which China tries to infiltrate the Taiwanese democracy and how it tries to intimidate the Taiwanese democracy. Now, you talked before in depth about, of course, the sort of coercive technique that they implement with the PLA, the missile threats, but also the Nancy Pelosi, of course, shooting of missiles and rockets towards the island. And I don't have to go into that a lot. You see here the so-called median line. This is, of course, an unofficial line, but the fact of the matter is that China respected it until a few years ago, and now they don't anymore, right? So you have, of course, this is the first point, I think, in which they try to sort of like intimidate Taiwanese citizens into thinking that if they would reunify with China, if they would cave in, and I will show you in a couple of minutes that they also have this so-called carrot and the stick approach, where they always try, of course, to entice Taiwanese people, and especially its business people, into reunifying for the kind of incentives they would obtain. And of course, this kind of technique, as I said, are meant to signalize that if they do reunify, there won't be a war, and that's the safest bet. And thus, the safest bet is voting for the most China-friendly party in Taiwan. But then there are other, of course, non-military ways to intimidate Taiwan. First of all, we have heard a little bit when you talked about the agricultural products. I mean, what they tried, well, they suspended de facto cross-strait communication when Tsai Ing-wen was elected. They also, of course, tried to block de facto Chinese tourists from going to Taiwan, and this was a big hit at the very beginning that many people suffered, of course, because especially taxi drivers, but also people working in the tourism industry really did feel the brunt of that. In addition, of course, China often tries to intimidate countries that deal with Taiwan to have less dealings with Taiwan, to diplomatically isolate Taiwan. It also tries to, you know, that diplomatic official countries, I think we still have 13 or 14 with the Vatican that still recognize the Republic of China, Taiwan. The number has gone down since 2016 when Tsai Ing-wen was elected, right? And, of course, it also has other coercive techniques, such as, for example, imposing its own way of understanding Taiwan as part of China, even in the nomenclature, like the name, for example, that China sometimes tries to pressure air companies, for instance, or other companies, to call Taiwan province of China or Chinese Taipei or all the names that are agreeable to China. And most of these companies usually comply for fear of economic retributions. And I'm almost finishing. The last 2 points which are interesting are China also tries to infiltrate the Taiwanese democracy, and it does so in 2 ways. It does that by spreading misinformation on social media. In the latest, I think, presidential elections, for example, suddenly within a couple of weeks, the former Kuomintang candidate, Han Kuo-yu, saw a huge rise in fan and supporters. But of course, most of these accounts were fake and were traced to mainland China. What it also does, it tries to infiltrate Taiwanese public opinion through media outlets. So a famous case is the one by tycoon Tsai Ing-wen. He's actually a food tycoon because he was working mostly in the food industries. I think he's known as the cookie king. But he also has other interests. He bought a big media company, and through that, of course, there were a lot of allegations he could try to pass a Chinese Communist Party-friendly version of events, which indeed has happened. So these are things that, of course, China tries to do actively. And Taiwan, of course, we heard, is also trying to respond to that in a way by increasing its military budget, by, of course, raising the conscript from 4 months to 1 year, passing laws such as the famous anti-infiltration law, which basically prohibits any Taiwanese parties from accepting money that can be traced back to the People's Republic of China. And of course, very importantly, something that they still have not been particularly successful in is reducing Taiwanese economic dependence from China. There's been a variety, this is not just a problem of the DPP, but even in the past, a variety of attempts to divert the business routes towards Southeast Asia, but of course, so far, it's still been a little bit unsuccessful. I don't have to go in, this is the last slide, but I'm not going to go into it because we talked about it before, you also mentioned it. So I think I will just leave it at that, and we can probably also go into the geopolitical implications of the national elections in January later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you, Simona, for this sharing. I mean, it adds a lot to this, you can say, case study of Taiwan, and it shows how comprehensive and complex this kind of threats are. I think it's really a very, very interesting situation where we could, of course, dedicate the whole day about, while we also try now to go a little bit into this transnational trends. And for this, I would like to ask Magdalena Solska to share her input. She directs currently an interesting project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation called Political Opposition in Post-Communist Democracies and Authoritarianism. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. So now we travel to Central and Eastern Europe, the region that has been in the headlines for more than a year, not only because of the war in Ukraine, or I would say probably over Ukraine, but also because of the so-called democratic or authoritarian backsliding that has been already mentioned. especially in the countries such as Hungary, and to a certain extent also in Poland. So Central and Eastern Europe is a very diverse region with different political systems. However, all these countries there share the common past, the legacy of the communist system, which happened to be totalitarian, not authoritarian. So this is a bit different from the previous presentation. And totalitarian legacy is especially visible in the weak civil societies, weak political parties, weak institutions, and weak states generally. Of course, I generalize now, but the countries have been dealing with the problems, and the democracies there, such Poland, Hungary, before the EU accession, but also afterwards, have never been impeccable. They have always dealt with certain problems, especially institutional ones. This is why I think we should approach the region from two different perspectives. So first of all, we have these fragile democracies where democracy is indeed threatened through the democratic or authoritarian backsliding. However, Hungary has gone further than Poland, for instance, so there are also differences among these countries. And we have countries that have not democratized yet. However, their elites declare to be pro-Western and pro-democracy, pro-EU accession. So they are kind of stuck in democratization process, and these are, for instance, the Western Balkan countries, Ukraine before the war, Georgia nowadays. And in these fragile democracies, we have several problems, but I think most important problem, and it is not actually in reference to the bad judicial reform that we have all heard about, but it is all about the lack of consensus among elites. A very extremely sharp political conflict that today also includes judiciary, which is very dangerous for democracy, of course, but also the attitude toward the European Union, for instance, or the foreign policy, which usually actually belongs to the consensus among elites. But today, all these issues have been politicized, and the sharp conflict, the so-called deliberate political polarization, actually is the core of danger for these democracies. So if we are talking about how to overcome these challenges, we have to first think about how to reach the consensus about among political elites. In terms of countries that have not democratized yet, we have different challenges such as oligarchs, for instance. No one knows actually what to do with them, but the question is why? Because there is no precedent. These countries have not democratized. They are called the countries of delayed transformation, and so far we don't know how to democratize them. This is without precedent, and of course there are many approaches. Paradoxically, perhaps the war or the crisis generally constitute also a chance for a reset and for building new foundations for liberal democracy. But I think this would have to go in pair with the credible EU accession perspective. In terms, for instance, of Ukraine, but also Georgia and Moldova. So oligarchs is one problem. Corruption of judiciary, for instance, is another problem. It would require constant and consistent reforms from the governments, but independent of who rules. So again, we are here with the same topic, the consensus among elites. So I basically think that this is the core of the problems of democracies today, and also of the stuck democratization process in this region. So first of all, so we have these challenges. We have first maybe approaches how to solve it. Exactly reset and dealing with oligarchs. In Poland and Hungary, searching for consensus among elites, but also we have the role of European Union, which could be positive and could be also negative, and I tend to think that in such countries as Poland, the European Union should not be involved as much. I would suggest that, for instance, in countries like Ukraine or Moldova, yes, the credible EU accession perspective plays a role, but Poland, where political opposition is still able to offer an alternative, I think that domestic actors should play a more important role than external ones. And here is another key point: domestic actors, political opposition, opposition parties. We should look at them first of all, because in Poland, the competition, political competition is not limited so far, has not been limited. Elections in Poland in October this year, and we still don't know who wins. There is no leader in the opinion polls. So it tells me that the political system is still competitive despite the very controversial judicial reform. We knew who won or who would win in Hungary last year. This is a great difference, I think. So domestic actors, parliamentary opposition, opposition parties, do they really offer the alternative? And I refer to maybe more global crisis of liberalism as such, as an alternative or as a credible ideology that could attach the common problems, not only in Central and Eastern Europe, but also in Western Europe. I think that opposition, for instance, in Poland, in my country of origin, has not done its homework so far, because we don't know what opposition really wants to achieve once it gets to power. We don't know how the judiciary should be further reformed in the real meaning of the word, reformed, in a positive way. We don't know whether these at least in theory, pro-European forces want Poland to join Eurozone, for instance. So far, it's not been that clear. So opposition, we should look always at the opposition and to what extent it offers really alternative. Because it happens that peace, law and justice, the ruling party in Poland, has a very structured program, and we don't have to like it, but it appeals to many people in Poland. So the status of opposition, the preparation of opposition to take over power is very important. Another point is civil society, but as I mentioned, civil society is relatively weak despite many protests and demonstrations, but the engagement in non-governmental organization in these countries is relatively weak. And there is a great gap between political parties and NGOs in these countries. So the impact of NGOs has been limited, and it could be a great field for improvements for the future. Another way is also to look at education, so investment in education, because in the end the young people of today will be the future elites of these countries. But here we have to be careful about the so-called brain drain. There is brain gain, but brain drain is another tendency that it means that young people, educated people, simply leave their countries of origin and go to Western Europe, for instance. So maybe for now, that's it. There are these problems.
Thank you very much. I mean, you address a lot of important aspects to add to this conversation, because it's, I mean, it's maybe easy to say what we don't want, but it's not so easy what we want, and how the capabilities to develop this offer is done, and that there is a lack, especially also in a case like Poland, what to offer. I mean, the example, for instance, that you at the same time as the election will have 4 national plebiscites instituted by the government. I mean, the answer by the opposition is basically not to participate. But is that enough? This is such a question. So having gone into this, let's say, also European, Eastern European challenge, maybe now even even more global outlook. Clara, you are teaching global governance at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and of course the expectations are very high to you now.
Thanks a lot. It's really a pleasure to be there. I will try to share a few thoughts about an ongoing research project that has been ongoing for a few years, and the question is basically why are some democracies more resilient than others, especially to big external shocks. And this is, of course, a very analytical object, but it is also a very concrete one, because at the time, like today, we have a PhD student in Gabon who is unable to go back to its university to finish his PhD because of the military coup. So this is also something we concretely experience working on these topics. I would like to share a few thoughts, looking at more maybe the global picture, and maybe starting with a form of, I don't know if it's a warning or a disclaimer. Currently, we do not have any quality data on objective measurement of democratic quality. This is something we all have to keep in mind when we mention different rankings and initiatives. They are based mostly on surveys, sometimes to experts, sometimes to people. You can say, but what's the problem with these surveys, right? The problem is that we observe 2 problems with these surveys. The first one is that as individuals, no matter how expert you are very, very good at seeing loss of democratic quality in neighboring countries, but not in your own country. That's a bit the frog in boiling water effect, right? The water gets warmer and warmer, but you're still in it, so you don't see really that there is something going on in your country. So that's a lack. The only initiative we have, and I wanted to do a short quiz, that is maybe the closer to an objective measurement of the quality of democracy, is a project known as Polit-5. Who knows about it in the room? I think 1 person. So it's you know, this is also a very limited outlook on the concentration of power in the hands of the executive. But this is the only project we have that is really trying to collect concrete, objective data based on legal changes, things that are really changing in that country, and not on perception of loss of democratic quality. This leads maybe the current data we have and picture we have to have some blind spots. So for example, we measure very poorly the number of rights citizens have in their country to decide on politics. So the participatory dimension is very badly assessed. We know very little also looking at different type of democratic systems about really what can citizens do in this country. So that's an invitation, right, to maybe collaborate and collect more data. Democracy has been a roller coaster for many, many years, but on a positive note, the average trend is positive. So this is something we have to keep in mind. If we look at long-term perspective, we see an increase of countries and an increase of democratic quality globally. We may be very focused on short-term events, but the long-term trend is positive. So that's also an encouragement, right, to continue to be involved in that. Another blind spot we have, of course, today in this panel, we discussed Taiwan, we discussed Eastern Europe, we discussed a lot of so-called young democracies. A trend that is perhaps unique to the time we are living is that we see recorded loss of democratic quality in established democracies. Long-established democracies such as the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Greece, are experiencing loss of democratic quality that are likely to be irreversible. Because there have been changing in the setup of the democratic system that have led the executive to take additional powers. And once the executive gets more power, it's very difficult then to take those powers back. And this is a problem because these countries have inspired a lot of young democracies in the world, right? Their constitutions have been taken as somehow role model on how things should be designed. And now we see that these countries are facing also issues and are not so able to integrate demands for further democratization, and especially demands focusing on granting more decision-making power to individuals through direct democracy mechanism, for example. Now, the question for this panel discussion was how to strengthen, right, democratic resilience, how to make sure that democracies are more able to resist pressures, either coming from outside or from inside, and to adapt to changing circumstances. And currently, because of the different type of crisis we are living with, somehow cascading effect, right, we had the financial crisis in 2007 and 2008, then the COVID-19 pandemic, then the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, now the war over Ukraine. This is a set of crises that, you know, accumulate with each other. We like to speak about a so-called narrow corridor, right? We are all walking in a narrow corridor. And on the one side of the corridor, you have further democratization of democratic systems. That you grant additional rights to people, you further improve democratic quality. The other side of the corridor is falling back into authoritarian rules, because crises are really moments where people tend to demand a quicker action, a more effective action, and short-term gains, right? We want to see the situation changing quickly, and to do that, we are ready to tell, I elect whoever is telling me that my life's going to be better tomorrow. So we are all walking in that very narrow path, and it's very difficult to know in which way the situation will evolve. Three maybe takeaway from the research project we've done. I think right now, both scholars, activists, and policymakers, there is a tendency to over-focus on the symptoms. The rise of populism, the rise of polarization, disinformation are symptoms of a loss of democratic quality. They are not root causes of it. So if we want to address that problem, we have to look at the root cause of that situation. And that's not easy, because what we observed in our research is that basically for democracy to backslide, a very minimal change is sufficient. And sometimes we don't really understand the implications of that change. And most of the time, a change in the rules of the political game. I will give you a very concrete example, the funding of political parties. That's something we all find very boring. I find it boring myself. But most of the time, very slight changes can have dramatic implications about the balance of power. And these are changes that often are not recorded in ranking of democratic quality, because it's very difficult. We may not see, you need to really monitor what's going on, right? What are the laws being made? What we see in a lot of democracies, and especially established democracies, is a trend towards a cartelization of party politic, which means that, the whole idea of the competition between political parties is that they would compete with each other, right? They would propose different options, and there's going to be a lot of offer, and we would elect the best offer possible. What we see is that there is more and more a willingness between political parties not to compete with each other, but to divide up power. And that's a problem we see in many different democratic systems. So the rules of the game matter, and we have to really always think about what's the trigger? What's the initial change that led us to a path that is towards a loss of democratic quality? That's not easy. Maybe you have insights into that based on your own experience. The second maybe insights we got from our research, we did a project which I like a lot. And what we did is that we compare how citizens, like representative set of citizens in countries, in different countries, basically a lot of countries, 70 countries, evaluate the quality of democracy in their country with the answers of experts. And we found that actually citizens are as able as experts. They give basically the same answer than experts. So our conclusion was that maybe it's better to ask people directly, right, what they think. There is the only problem with that is that, of course, if you go to non-democratic countries, then citizens, they don't answer. They say the country is like, you go to Russia, people say, top democracy, right? Why? Because when you live under an authoritarian regime, then you're also afraid to say, well, there are problems in my country. But still, I think that led us to conclude that citizens are really the first antibody of democracies, and that we should invest more on citizens and citizen organizations if we want to make democracy more resilient. What we observe is that the start of the backslide starts when policymakers start to distrust the ability of citizens to make good and adequate decisions. And the last, maybe, insights from our project is about the role of international organization, right? And especially the role of the EU. And what we found is that the way democratic support is currently designed at the EU level is leading to two core problems. The first is that, at best, it is ineffective. Why? Because it targets mostly the executive. So the idea is to make sure that elections are properly organized. And what we see is that in many authoritarian regime, leaders are super good at organizing elections. No question about that. Granting rights to people is another story. And in the worst case scenario, it can make things worse. So there is also, I think, a need to think about what democracy promotion is about, how we can cooperate with each other, and what's the role also of international organization should be, taking into account that we really have to focus on citizens and also the root causes of the problem. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Clara, for this insights and sharing, and also addressing the issue of the difficult question of quality of democracy. What do we mean with a good democracy? Of course, there can be very different views, but at the same time, it's also it's not far from enough to just say we have different democratic systems, everything is on its own. We know today that democracy has a global impact, it has a global importance, and it is seen globally as a focal point. So we need to become better in understanding how it works, how we can improve it, and how we can work together on it. So before I want to open the conversation with all of you, I just like to give you, each of you, the opportunity to put a question forward to each another, if you have one, out of what you have heard from each another, to a little bit start this kind of transdisciplinary approach to this, because of course you are all in very much in your work, but at the same time there are always questions you cannot address with your own field. So maybe you have a question to each another. Some of you.
Shall I start? Yeah. I have a question. Well, yeah, the question to you, Clara. So, because I agree actually with everything what you said, and I was wondering, because you mentioned the democracy indices, right? And I agree that the indicators do not always show reflect the real changes in democracy, for instance, or it is generally very difficult to measure the quality of democracy, yes. But exactly this is what I've been thinking as well, and I was thinking that opposition plays a role, looking at opposition exactly, the quality of opposition and the possibility of opposition to offer an alternative. Isn't it the indicator? They could really somehow show where democracy in respective country is actually, or where it heads to.
And we answer on the
Yeah,
spot.
you have not more than 1 minute.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good one. That is one also that is partly taken into account in that Polit-5 project, especially if you take a broader look at what we refer to as opposition. So not only parliamentary opposition, but also judicial opposition, but also citizen opposition, right? The ability to really actually counteract and have actually powers in deciding of the rules of the games. I would say that's a very good indicator, yeah. But now collecting data is another story.
Is there another question?
Yeah, I also have a question for you, sorry. You said that nowadays we very often see parties not competing with each other, but rather wanting to divide power, right? My question would be, do you think that that's really the intent, or is it the outcome of a situation in which they simply cannot win the elections on their own? I'm thinking of Italy, for example, and very often after Berlusconi, who was, of course, a very controversial political figure, but the fact of the matter is that not even his party was then able to win the elections cleanly, and so they were forced to divide power in a coalition. So my questions were...
Yeah, I think there are two different things, right? There is the coalition building process that you have, for example, in the Netherlands, the country I work for. Last election we had 33 parties and they have to form a coalition. But I would say this is a bit different than the idea of cartel parties, because the whole idea or the whole principle, and if we transfer that to companies, we think about it very clearly, right? Competition between companies on a market. The idea was to say, okay, we're gonna lock these companies in a room with nobody looking at what they are doing, and we're gonna hope that there's gonna be competition at the end. And that's what we do with political parties, right? They sit together in an assembly, sometimes with limited access to what they discuss, and we hope that competition will happen. So I think this cartelization is actually coming from a lack of transparency about the type of discussions and the type of also compromise they reach when they decide to allocate specific positions. We need to have more transparent information about that type of discussions, I would say. If not, well, they're going to just say, you take that, I take this, and that's over.
And that's in fact a very current issue here in Switzerland, where for the first time there is a transparency law.
Yeah.
Swiss political parties have been very good in finding compromise, but not so good in showing which kind of money is involved. But that's a discussion we may also deepen here. Do you have a question?
Yes, I have actually a question for maybe both of you, because you look at different contexts. Something that I have always wondered is the role of political culture, right? Democratic culture in explaining what we see in terms of the evolution of democracy worldwide. And I found it very difficult to know whether the role of pro-democratic attitudes that are very high is kind of a driver of, you know, the loss of democratic quality, or is an outcome of something else, right? That when you have highly functioning system, then you have a stronger democratic culture, and then you're more able to prevent loss of democratic quality. So I was wondering, looking at also the cases you look at, what's really the role of the democratic culture, the political culture of a country in that picture?
Do you want to go first? I'm still thinking about the answer. I think Taiwan as a very peculiar, maybe Andrea also will know more about this than me, but I think in terms of political culture, I mean, Taiwan came out of, as you said, one of the longest, actually, martial law rule imposed brutally on its people. So what it knew, and to a certain extent what many citizens understood as China, the internal China, was associated with an authoritarian regime. And I think that really has permeated the very first birth of democracy, when you could establish political parties. Between 86 was before the abolition of martial law, but already there was a flurry of activities, right? And so I think in a way it was a bit of a, maybe a flawed understanding that everything that went against the Kuomintang was de facto democratic. That was not really the case, and a very big disappointment for many people, for example, in civil society, was when Chen Shui-bian, the very first president from an opposition party, the DPP, your own party, came to the power. And then many problems came to the fore, many things were betrayed, many promises that were made to activists. So I think I would keep it short, because I think that you're asking us to keep it a bit short, but I think at the beginning, this very deep-set understanding that anything that went against the Kuomintang was de facto democratic, which wasn't true, has really permeated for a while. But Taiwan came out of it recently and has established, of course, I think, what I believe to be a quite mature, despite the fistfights in the parliament, which remind me of my own country, Italy. I'm half Swiss, half Italian, so I always had a sympathy for that. But despite for that, this is just a joke, of course, I think Taiwan has become now a place we can be really, truly proud of in this kind of setting, where we hear a lot of other backsliding and bad situations. Over to you.
Yeah, I think it is one of the decisive factors, actually, political culture, but political culture of elites and political culture of the people, right? So political culture of the elites has been extremely problematic in this region, because we have this attitude of the winner takes it all, right? There is to achieve a compromise, or to be engaged opposition parties in the legislation process, for instance, or even in the judicial reform. It has not happened. It wouldn't. I think it wouldn't happen even under the current opposition. So this kind of attitude is unfortunately present in young democracies, but also in hybrid regimes, etc. In terms of the people, right? Because here Poland is a paradigmatic case, I think, because Polish people are one of the most pro-European societies, pro-EU. Nonetheless, they have elected peace twice, possibly the third time in a month. And they do that not because of their lack, or because they miss democratic culture, or because they don't believe in democratic values. I think this is another problem that, and I refer back to what you said about cartelization, because cartel parties, including opposition parties today, do not address very frequently the problems of society, and this paves the way to such populist parties as PiS. So PiS and other parties of this kind are more responsive, and this lies at the center of the electoral success in the young democracies, not maybe necessarily the lack of democratic values or the lack of knowledge about them.
Thank you very much. It's an interesting takeaway to understand that Simona has some sympathy for fist fighting in parliaments. But we will continue here with a very nice dialogue. So no fights, but questions, thoughts from all of you are now most welcome. Who wants to? We have gentlemen in the back. And it's good if you say something to be short, but also to say who you are.
Yes, Raban Fuhrmann from the Academy for Learning Democracy. My question refers on the different experiences you are the whole morning we're already telling, and it is I'm wondering why we have like a lack on a specific field on democracy politics, Demokratiepolitik in German. We have, like political fields for almost every problem, environmental and demographic, but we don't have a specific established, even maybe with constitutional rights established political institution focusing on the continuous improvement of political institutions. And so my question is, what experiences do you have in your countries? Are there approaches in closing this gap. Now, we need an institution for improvement of politics, and this must be independent. It cannot be, be part of the government. We have some discussions in Germany. We have it on the local level, but still not on the federal level.
Thank you very much. So the question about explicit democratizing institutions. Is there anything from your research, your experience, which points into this direction?
Yeah, I think that's a bit maybe the core of the matter, right? Because often, so working on that different project, I remember having a talk with the head of the rule of law division at the European Commission. And basically, well, she told me, I studied political science, and I have no clue about how to approach that topic, right? I don't know what democratic engineering is about. What are the type of, changes we should promote? I just have no clue. I'm able to compare political system, but, you ask me how to change that situation. I just don't know. And I think that's also part, I agree, right? There is a real need to also train a new generation of policymakers, of practitioners about exactly that, right? And be able to think, I think, based on the context, because there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. I mean, we all know what the end goal is, but reaching that point may take different paths depending on the context and the specific problems you face in that context. So we have very little answer for that. I think there is really a need in that regard.
Any other?
Yeah, this is not only the core matter, as you say, but also perhaps the core problem of these countries, Central and Eastern Europe, because there are, of course, foundations, right? But they are usually funded from abroad, which is a bit problematic always in these societies. So, like homegrown institutions, for sure there are, but if they are so effective, I'm not sure. The most, the famous ones are funded from abroad. This is, it could, well, they have therefore ambivalent maybe appeal to society. But I wanted to say also something about the studies of political science, because I studied in Germany. At my alma mater in Regensburg, there is still the program Demokratiewissenschaft, right? The science of democracy. Political science as a discipline in these countries of Central and Eastern Europe has been unfortunately pretty weak. And especially in Poland and Hungary, what a coincidence, right? Better, well, the picture of political science is better, seems to be better in Czech Republic, for instance, in the region. So I think we should maybe start from there, university, right? And in Poland, I must add simply, just to have the whole picture, sociology is of much better quality than political science, interestingly. But as a discipline, it is something that should be improved, for sure.
So if I understood your question, you were also asking concretely about what mechanism institutes were set up, right? I would also invite you afterwards maybe to say something. You probably have a more hands-on information than me, but I would say that Taiwan, especially in the past 2 to 3 years, really constitutes a good example of a participatory democracy. You mentioned first the Sunflower Student Movement. This was a movement in which especially young people protested by occupying the parliament for 3 weeks against the passing of another agreement with China. The first one was 2010 for the economy, the second one was for service trade. And they protested mostly because they believed that the Kuomintang under Ma Ying-jeou back then reached the decision under a black box. So with no transparency, hence the name Sunflower Shedding Sunlight. So why am I saying this? After when Taiwan came along, and especially the pandemic also helped in this, the corona pandemic, a whole series of institutes and mechanisms were actually set up to allow each individual citizen to participate by just telling his or own opinion on a variety of things. So these, I would say, are really concrete mechanisms, but maybe you also have something to add from your own experience as a politician?
Right, thank you. I think I'll just be really honest with you that when absolute power comes with absolute corruption, that DPP is growing bigger and bigger, but the opposition party in Taiwan, we do need a more healthy opposition party to really strengthen their check and balance capabilities. So civil society, I would say in Taiwan, is a little bit weakened through these years because they put their hopes on us, the DPP. But there were always corrupt politicians. But we'll see that the civil society is still there, remains strong, and they still have a voice about certain domestic issues, like the distribution of income and wealth, and also the social welfare systems as well. But when it comes to democracy, that under DPP's governance, that people would have less worry about the crush of Taiwan's democracy. However, it is an issue that the civil societies, the proper operation of the NGOs would eventually need to be more supportive by the society itself. That is also explains why the small political parties are now welcomed in Taiwan. That's the it's quite a new thing for us. But we say that traditional political games are not so much welcomed at this in Taiwan at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a very short add to that, just as a historic information. I mean, in 2003, several of us here in this room were invited first time to Taiwan, and we were invited by the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, which is a domestic democracy support institution, and from that first encounter, the idea of the Swiss Democracy Foundation was born. So there are global ideas traveling, and now we are here together. Thank you. So next is, yeah? And then you, yeah? Thomas, and then, yeah? And, oh yeah, you choose. That's good.
We start here, and then I come back over to the back.
Yeah, I was in South Africa for quite some time this year, a long time democracy. But the discussion there, it really struck me hard, is about state failure, which means actually the ANC having taken over the state by democratic means and sometimes really run down, like for instance, no railway system anymore in South Africa. So I was wondering what you think about how can democracies bring something like an economically fair future, or as you put it, Roberto, in the morning, a brighter vision for the world, which includes everybody also in an economic point of view.
I think we gathered a couple of questions and inputs, so we, yeah.
Oh, I don't like that. Okay. I don't like it when you hold it. I have to, okay. I would like to have your opinion. We speak about the citizens, how they can influence a movement. And we have the climate movements, I say the different kinds in several countries. And there's, as a reaction, a kind of polarization which is enforced by this theme. Would like to know your opinion, how you observe this. Is it, in which direction do you think goes this polarization? Or do you really think, is it a polarization?
One more, yeah.
Hi, my name is Emmanuel Riem, and I'm Swiss, but I work for the US Embassy. And when comparing those two countries, which are both very old democracies, I find it very interesting that you have much more polarization in the US in contrast to Switzerland. And my question is, could it be that direct democracy is actually the solution to political participation of civil society? That having this voice is kind of the checks and balances that we would need in politics. Yeah, thank you.
Last one.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Roger Kelvener, and I have a question which I think is tailored to Magda on the Copenhagen criteria. I would like to, if you can give us an assessment how you see the role of the Copenhagen criteria in regarding the integration of the Central European countries, or how would we design them in hindsight with the experience we have made? Have they been sufficient or not?
Thank you very much. Now we have a lot of things. Maybe you start directly.
Mm-hmm. You meant Copenhagen criteria, right? So the EU accession. So in terms of Central and Eastern Europe, Poland, young democracies, right, that are now in the EU, you mean? So they worked because, well, it was good timing as well, right? The fall of communism, the future was European. The countries, well, the societies felt they were coming back to Europe after the dark hour of communism, after being like under communist rule, not independent, etc. So this was like a good story, and also the path to follow. No, because what I think sometimes that today these societies, they had criteria to fulfill, and now they are free, and they are a bit lacking orientation. So what is the future then, right? They don't have other stages to achieve. They should, well, the climate change, of course, there are many challenges to follow, but they don't have the criteria to pursue somehow to achieve the goals, right? So the whole EU accession process was successful out of historical reasons, and also because these are truly pro-European societies, truly, and also the elites. The elites, the factor of elites is for me most decisive. It is a very easy and banal, maybe, a statement that you need Democrats for democracy to develop, right? Democrats at power for democracy to develop. And it was the case in these countries. Now, about the countries that declare to be pro-European, pro-EU, but are stuck in democratization process, they are, well, because I think you mentioned that already, Clara, because this is, it is not enough for European Union to propose some institutions, so a number of legal solutions. It also must go hand in hand with qualitative assessment of achievement and of acting according to the new rules. This is missing, I think, at the moment on the side of European Union. The criteria remain very formalistic, and in this sense, superficial. And of course, for instance, President Vučić, the president of Serbia, can also sell his support of the EU inside the country, right? As a legitimate leader who is pro-EU outside, but inside the country he still sustains a quasi-authoritarian regime. So I think here the EU accession process should be refined. This is what I meant with credible EU perspective for these countries, more qualitative than quantitative, perhaps. But I would also like to address another question about USA and Switzerland. I think that it's a bit, well, direct democracy for sure helps to depolarize, But also the very institutional design of Switzerland is quite different, obviously, from the American one. The very fact that there are almost all parties in government, and the opposition comes actually from the government, right, the SVP. I think the institutional solution also contributes to the depolarization. We have, in America, we have old parties that are apparently unable to propose new candidates, a bit younger maybe, for presidential elections. So I think the crisis of the parties and what already has been mentioned, the cartelization as well, it also affects the American old democracy. But I would go for this institutional design, and direct democracy is a part of it as well. Yeah.
At least Mr. Romney is not running again for. Yeah. But yes, do you have?
Well, I mean, I'm a cross-strait specialist, so I don't dare to make any comments about the structural factors on democracy. I leave it to my colleagues. The only thing I can say, maybe the question of Emmanuel Riem. I think Taiwan also has been experimenting with institutes that we have in direct democracies. I mentioned before the referenda, for example, as an example of something that brings you closer to the citizens, allows them to express themselves. It has, for that reason, also talked about lowering the threshold. But I think, and maybe you will correct me if I'm wrong, that it's probably easier to have a direct form of democracy in a country that is as small as Switzerland than in a much bigger countries like the United States. But I could be wrong about that, so I'll just leave it at that and leave you to reply to the rest of the questions.
Yeah, these are great questions. I was thinking a bit about them. I think about your question, Thomas. So part of my teaching is on development economics, right? So trying to, so I have students from all over the world, and their first question is democracy good for development, or isn't it? And I think it's quite difficult to have a clear answer, because basically what we know is that you can have very high level of growth and very high level of also poverty alleviation in non-democratic regime at first. That's a bit what the Chinese are selling to the world, right? We don't need to be a democracy to get a massive amount of people out of poverty. But what we know is that we can't have sustainable growth, so sustainable development, without democracy. And I think when thinking about especially the Chinese regime, the Popular Republic of China, there is a clear awareness that at some point there will have to be reforms because the situation is not sustainable. So that's, I think, what is complicated in that discussion is that democracy can be a very abstract concept. But you can experience it. I mean, you have to connect it to concrete experience people make. So, for example, when they have to thinking about development, they want to set up a business. Well, it's more likely that in a non-democratic country they will have to pay a lot to the public administration to get things done. They will have to pay a bribe. That's also is very negative, right, for economic prosperity. So I think there is really a need to connect the discussion about democracy as a end goal, a normative value we cherish, with the fact that, yes, democracies do demonstrate that they perform better. During COVID-19, I was really struck by the debates about, well, maybe authoritarian regimes are better than democracy to manage pandemic. Well, I'm not sure, right? So we have also to keep always the discussion, which is not only about democracies are good in itself, but they perform better on many, many indicators. And we have to also, I think, tell that story to people. About polarization, I think there have always been certain level of polarization, right? The very idea of democracy is that we have competing projects, and sometimes, we disagree on projects. What is new, I would say, right now that we observe is that this is combined with record level of distrust between people. So it's not only that you disagree, but that you don't want to speak with others. And that's a big problem, because if you want to reach a compromise, you have to recognize that maybe the other has some form of, right in what they say. And we observe that in society that gets more and more polarized, the critical factor is really the level of distrust, the fact that you don't recognize the other group as an interlocutor for political decisions. And that is triggered by many reasons. I think one of the reasons is that we see a lot that especially majority system, electoral systems that are based on, you know, sizing a majority, they create a lot of polarization because they exclude a lot of people from power. I'm coming from France originally, so the electoral system we have is creating a situation where you can have the majority at the National Assembly with the support of 30% of the electorate. So it concretely means that you have 30% of people who are happy about the government and 70% who are unhappy about the government. And this is really like create situations that are on the edge of also civil conflicts, right? Because when you have a massive amount of people who don't feel, you know, the government is representing them, then you have an issue because people can get really violent, right, about demanding change. The last thing, I mean, I would support that. I think, you know, looking at the research I do, comparing countries, I think direct democracy really helps in reducing polarization, in improving democratic quality, the inclusiveness of the institution, but mostly through what we call its indirect effect. So not only when people directly vote, you know, so they vote about something and that changes the policy, but because when citizens have the possibility to initiate, especially constitutional changes, it changes everything about the type of calculus political parties make. So they have to be inclusive in their consultation. They have to make sure that they will not face an initiative and a referendum. And that's, I think, the major effect of direct democracy. That is, by the way, I think, very wrongly classified in existing research. Most of the time, direct democracy is considered as a populist institution, right? It's majority rule. Well, what we observe is that direct democracy creates more liberal democracy than purely the representative democracy without that citizen check. So there is, I think, also a need to reclassify also the way we think about democratic system to also be better able to know what are the impact of specific policy changes on democratic quality.
Thank you. One additional layer which was addressed also is the urgency of climate change, what it impacts the democratic conversation. I mean, we are talking about a global fight for freedom and human rights. At the same time, you have the global fight for a climate which makes life possible on Earth. How does this impact the democratic developments in your view out of your work? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I can give my I'm giving my 2 cents. It feels.
Yes.
I think it's a bit. It's tricky because there are different types of discourses about the need to fight climate change, and one set of narratives is about this is an emergency. We need rapid solution. People will not take the right decision. They will not accept to lose their own comfort. And we have a lot, also if you compare green parties in different countries, they can support very, undemocratic solutions, technocratic solutions, thinking, okay, we have just no time to discuss about that. And that's a huge risk, that the climate change discussion got a bit hijacked by the idea, this is really urgent, we need someone who is solving that situation and we're going to discuss afterwards later. And I think that what we see in some systems, I think the Swiss system is one, there are others, is that when you have a political deliberation on that topic, you have also policies that are going in the right direction, that are addressing the issues. So I would say that's a bit of a risk, is that by mentioning that we have to act quickly, then we say, well, we suspend democracy for a bit of time. Yeah.
Well, maybe in the case of China, I mean, often is the case that we talk about the country as we need it to solve global problems such as climate change, right? But in my opinion, maybe this is a controversial opinion, but I think that by doing this, we very often, we had a previous discussion here a few months ago or last year in September about Xinjiang, and where we talked about remaining in dialogue with China. Now, what happens very often when we talk about climate change is a very similar thing. We need China, we need to dialogue with China, it's important, it's also one of the biggest emitter of gases. And so, in my opinion, that we risk often into going in the counter direction of caving in, not actually requesting the sufficient amount of human rights respect, which is clearly not happening in many parts of the countries, so that we can keep up dialoguing with China. And I think this is a very tricky and problematic situation.
Yeah, this is a difficult question because the topic has been kind of neglected in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe because there are other priorities at the moment. First of all, the security and other issues, simply structural reforms that are underway. Of course, these countries also deal with the communist legacy. So in terms of climate change, it is, I think, another potential for even a conflict with the European Union, especially when I think of Poland. So I would say that this topic is not yet seen as a priority for the governments in the region. Like there are different issues now on the agenda.
Magdalena, Simona, Clara, thank you very much. Yes, with this conversation we conclude this morning, this very intense morning. We need some fresh air, we need some food, we need to stand up, and at 1:30 we gather here again with lightning talks about practical examples how to work on these issues on the local and other levels. Thank you and good appetite. Thank you.